In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, where the sun bakes secrets into the cracked earth and buzzards circle truths long dead, a single act of mercy can rewrite the future of an entire land. This isn't a tale of legendary lawmen or notorious outlaws. It's the story of a lone widow, Abigail Monroe, haunted by a past she couldn't escape. She found a man dying in the dust, an Apache warrior, the very people she blamed for her sorrow. In saving his life, she unknowingly held the destiny of a nation in her hands, for the bleeding man she would drag across the desert was no ordinary brave. He was Kohana, the son of a great chief, the future leader of the Chiricahua people. This is the story of their journey, a crucible of fire, blood, and betrayal that would either forge a legendary peace or shatter two worlds forever. The silence of the Arizona Territory was a living thing. It was in the vast cerulean sky, stretched taut from one jagged horizon to the other. It was in the shimmer of heat rising from the baked clay and sandstone, a visible distortion of a world bleached by a relentless sun. And for Abigail Monroe, it was in the hollow chambers of her heart, an echo in the adobe ranch house that had once been filled with the low, steady voice of her husband, Thomas. It had been a year since Thomas was taken from her. A year since the posse led by the town's most powerful cattle baron, Bartholomew Corbin, had brought him back slung over a horse. Apache raid. Corbin had set his voice a gravelly performance of sympathy. He'd pointed to the arrow, fletching the brutal efficiency of the kill. They came for the well at the South Pass. Thomas must have stumbled upon them. Abigail had accepted it. What choice did she have? Grief was a shroud, and in the Arizona borderlands of the 1870s, conflict with the Apache was a grim and constant rhythm of life. She buried Thomas under the lone mesquite tree that offered the ranch its only shade, and the silence began. Her life became a ritual of survival. She was a tall, sturdy woman in her late 20s, with sun-streaked brown hair she kept tied in a severe bun, and hands calloused from mending fences, hauling water, and tending the small herd of cattle Thomas had left her. Her neighbors, the few who were scattered miles apart, called her stubborn for staying. Bartholomew Corbin, whose massive C-bar ranch bordered her modest spread on 3 sides, called it foolish. He'd made several offers for her land, each one more insultingly low than the last. "A woman alone has no business out here, Mrs. Monroe," he'd said, his smile never quite reaching his cold, calculating eyes. "This is hard country. Dangerous country." He wanted her land for its access to Bitter Creek, the only year-round water source for 50 miles. Her ranch was the cork in his bottle, and he was a man who hated thirst. Abigail always refused. The ranch was all she had left of Thomas. Selling it felt like selling his memory. So she endured. She endured the dust that coated everything, the nights punctuated by the yipping of coyotes and the crushing weight of her solitude. She learned to read the land, to know the subtle shift in the wind that heralded a storm, to recognize the tracks of a mountain lion near her chicken coop. She became as much a part of the harsh landscape as the saguaro cacti that stood like silent sentinels on the ridges. On a blistering afternoon in late August, the kind of day that felt like living inside a furnace, Abigail rode her steady buckskin mare Daisy toward the South Pass. The windmill at the main well had been groaning for a week, and she needed to check the gear mechanism. It was a long, hot ride, taking her to the very edge of her property, a place she hadn't visited since they'd found Thomas there. The air grew heavy as she approached the cluster of rock formations that guarded the pass. This was Apache territory, or what the settlers called it. a place of ghosts and whispers. She dismounted, tying Daisy to a scrubby Palo Verde tree, and drew the rifle from its scabbard. It was a Winchester .73, Thomas's rifle. It felt heavy and familiar in her hands. She scanned the area, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of the rocks, the shadow-draped entrance to the pass. Everything was still. Too still. The usual drone of insects was absent. Even the birds were silent. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She crept forward, her boots making soft sounds in the thick dust. And then she saw it. A smudge of dark crimson against the ochre-colored dirt leading from the mouth of the pass. It was fresh. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She followed the trail of blood with her eyes, and it led her to a heap of buckskin and black hair lying behind a large boulder. Her first instinct was raw, unadulterated fear. Apache. The word screamed in her mind. Her thumb moved to the hammer of the Winchester. The stories Corbin and his men told in town flooded her memory. Tales of brutal raids of families slaughtered of a savage, merciless enemy. The people who had killed Thomas. She raised the rifle, the metal hot against her shoulder. The figure was a man, lying face down. His back was a mess of torn buckskin and blood. A deep gash, not from an arrow, but a blade ran from his shoulder down his side. He was still, but she could see the faint, shallow rise and fall of his breathing. He was alive. She stood there for a long minute, the sun beating down on her, the silence pressing in. Every rational thought, every warning from her neighbors, every ounce of her own grief and anger told her to turn around, get on her horse, and ride away. Leave him for the vultures. He was the enemy. He would likely kill her if he had the strength. It was justice. But then her eyes fell on his hand. Fingers curled loosely in the dust. It was a strong hand, but it looked so human. Not the claw of a monster from a campfire story. She thought of Thomas lying in the dirt, bleeding and alone. Had he been afraid? Had he wished for a kind hand, for a sip of water, for a moment of mercy in his final moments? The rifle felt impossibly heavy. With a shuddering breath that was half a sob, Abigail lowered the weapon. She couldn't do it. She couldn't leave him. Whatever he was, whatever his people had done, he was a man dying in the dirt, and she was the only soul to see it. In that moment, her own humanity was more important than her hatred. She leaned the Winchester against the boulder and cautiously approached. She knelt, her dress immediately soaking up the heat from the ground. "Hey," she said softly, her voice raspy from disuse. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. She gently placed her fingers on his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, but it was thready and weak. His skin was feverishly hot. If he stayed out here, the sun would finish him before his wound did. Her mind raced. She couldn't take him back to her ranch. If Corbin or any of his men found out she was harboring an Apache, they'd brand her a traitor. They might even form a lynch mob. The town of Dusty Gulch wasn't known for its nuanced understanding of things. But she couldn't leave him. The decision once made settled in her with a grim certainty. There was one place, a place no one ever went. An old line shack, a relic from a previous owner, nestled deep in a box canyon, about 15 miles northeast, well within her property, but far from any prying eyes. It was little more than a ruin, but it had a roof and was near a small seasonal spring. Getting him there would be a Herculean task. He was a powerfully built man, and she was alone. But the alternative was to watch him die. "All right," she whispered, as much to herself as to the unconscious man. "It seems you and I are going on a little trip." She went back to Daisy and retrieved her canteen. She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat, soaked it with the precious water, and returned to the warrior. Gently, she turned his head and began to clean the grit and blood from his face. He had high, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a proud aquiline nose. His face was a mask of pain, even in unconsciousness. For the first time, she wasn't looking at an Apache. She was looking at a man. He stirred a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open. They were as black as obsidian, and for a moment they were unfocused. Then they locked onto her, and the confusion was replaced by a flash of pure, primal hostility. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a surprising strength. Abigail didn't flinch. She met his glare with a steady gaze of her own. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, her voice even. "You're hurt bad. If you stay here, you'll die." He didn't seem to understand her words, but he understood her tone. His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, but his eyes remained wary, searching her face for deceit. He was like a cornered wolf ready to fight to the death despite his injuries. She slowly held up the canteen. "Water," she said, pointing to his cracked lips. His gaze flickered to the canteen, and then back to her. The battle in his eyes was plain to see: suspicion versus a desperate, burning thirst. Finally, his pride gave way to need. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. She supported his head and carefully tipped the canteen to his lips. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin. When he was done, he sank back, his energy spent. His eyes closed, but she knew he was not unconscious. He was watching her, judging her. Now came the hardest part. She went back to her horse. She knew Daisy could not carry them both, not for 15 miles in this heat. He would have to walk at least some of the way. She returned to him, holstering her pistol on her hip and keeping the rifle close. She used a mixture of gestures and simple words, pointing to her horse, then to the distant northern ridges, then back to him. "We have to go. Walk." He understood. With a monumental effort, he used the boulder to push himself into a sitting position, his face contorting in a silent scream of pain as the movement tore at the wound on his back. He looked at her, then at her horse, then at the rifle she carried. The question was clear in his eyes. Was she his savior or his captor? Abigail had no answer for him. In truth, she wasn't sure herself. All she knew was that she had crossed a line. By offering that first sip of water, she had bound her fate to that of the bleeding man at her feet, a man whose name she didn't know and whose people she had every reason to despise, unaware that this single, compassionate act was a stone tossed into the still pond of the territory, and its ripples would soon become a tidal wave. She was helping a man named Kohana, and in doing so, she was setting in motion a chain of events that would change her life and the future of the Chiricahua forever. The journey to the line shack was a waking nightmare. The sun was a malevolent eye in the sky, searing the landscape and draining the strength from their bodies. Abigail named the Apache Black Hawk in her mind for the intensity of his dark eyes. He refused to speak, communicating only through grunts or the subtlest of gestures. He also refused her help to stand. Pride, she realized, was a language they both understood. He used the boulder to haul his own weight to his feet, swaying precariously. His breath came in ragged gasps, and a fresh wave of blood stained the back of his buckskin shirt. He leaned heavily against the rock, his body trembling with the effort, but his eyes were defiant. "We have to move," Abigail said, her voice gentle but firm. "At this pace, the buzzards will have us both before sundown." He gave a slight nod, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon, as if calculating the impossible distance. He took one step, then another, his gait a painful shuffling limp. Abigail walked beside him, leading Daisy with one hand, her Winchester clutched in the other. It was a strange procession, a lone white woman, a wounded Apache warrior, and a patient horse moving like ghosts through a shimmering world of heat and dust. Every few hundred yards, he would have to stop leaning against a rock or a saguaro to keep from collapsing. During these pauses, Abigail would give him water, a shared ritual that became their only form of communication. She would uncap the canteen, and he would accept it, his eyes never leaving hers. In those moments, an unspoken understanding began to form. It wasn't trust, not yet, but a mutual acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability. They were two specks of life in an ocean of death, and for now they needed each other to survive. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and doubt. What was she doing? She was leading an Apache, a killer, onto her own land. She was risking everything, her safety, her ranch, her very life, for a man who would likely slit her throat the moment his strength returned. The image of Thomas, pale and still, flashed in her mind, and a wave of guilt washed over her. She was betraying him, helping one of the people who had murdered him. But then she would look at the warrior, at the sweat beading on his brow, the grim set of his jaw as he fought against the agony of his wound, and she saw not a monster, but a man of incredible fortitude. She saw a flicker of the same stubborn resilience that kept her on the ranch, that made her face down Bartholomew Corbin, that forced her to get up every morning and face the crushing silence. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, they reached a small arroyo. The warrior stumbled his legs, finally giving out. He fell to his knees with a choked cry of pain. Abigail rushed to his side. "That's enough," she said, kneeling beside him. "We'll rest here for the night." His fever was worse. She could feel the heat radiating from him. His breathing was shallow, and his lips were cracked and dry. She knew if the infection in his wound wasn't treated, he wouldn't last until morning. While he drifted in and out of a feverish state, Abigail gathered what little brushwood she could find. She started a small, smokeless fire in the shelter of the arroyo using the skills Thomas had taught her. The night brought a deceptive chill, and the small flames were a comfort against the encroaching darkness. She had to see the wound. It was the only way. "I need to look at your back," she said slowly and clearly, using her hands to mime pulling away his shirt. His eyes snapped open instantly, alert and hostile. He shook his head, a flicker of fear, or perhaps shame, in his gaze. He didn't want her to see the injury, to see him so vulnerable. "The wound is poisoned," she insisted, her voice taking on a new authority. "If I don't clean it, you will die. Do you understand, die?" She drew a finger across her own throat to emphasize the point. He stared at her for a long moment, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. He was assessing her, weighing his chances. Finally, with a sigh of resignation that seemed to drain the last of his strength, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. With painstaking gentleness, she used her knife to cut away the blood-caked buckskin. The sight of the wound made her stomach lurch. It was a deep, vicious cut, at least 10 inches long. The edges were inflamed and swollen, a clear sign of infection. It wasn't a clean cut from a fighting knife. It was ragged, torn. And embedded deep within the flesh, she saw something glint in the firelight. Using the tip of her knife, she carefully probed the wound. The warrior grunted in pain, his fists clenching in the sand. But he remained still. Her fingers found the object. It wasn't a piece of rock or a broken arrow tip. It was a piece of metal, oddly shaped. She worked it loose and pulled it out. She held it up to the firelight, wiping the blood away on her sleeve. It was a shard of metal about an inch long, and on its surface was a distinct stamped marking, a C with a bar underneath it, the brand of the C-Bar Ranch, Bartholomew Corbin's brand. Abigail froze the piece of metal cold in her palm despite the fire. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't possible. Why would a piece of a branding iron be in this man's back? Branding irons were for cattle, not. And then the pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so ugly, so monstrous, it stole her breath. Corbin's relentless desire for her land. The Apache raid that had happened at the exact spot that gave him an excuse to bring a posse onto her property. The arrow they'd shown her from Thomas's body. Had she ever really looked at it closely, or had she been too blinded by grief? An arrow is easy to plant. What if there had been no Apache raid? What if Corbin's own men, disguised as Apaches, had killed Thomas to scare her off the land? And this warrior, maybe he hadn't been attacking. Maybe he'd witnessed it. Maybe he had been attacked by the same men. The wound on his back was not a typical fighting wound. It was ragged, as if he'd been struck from behind while trying to flee. The entire foundation of her world crumbled in that instant. The grief she carried was not just for her husband's death, but for a lie told by the man who smiled at her in town, who offered his condolences, who tried to buy the very land he'd made her a widow to acquire. Her hatred for the Apache, the burning anger that had fueled her for a year, evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, terrifying rage directed squarely at Bartholomew Corbin. She looked at the wounded man by the fire. He was no longer her enemy. He was her only ally. He was the only other person who knew the truth, even if he couldn't speak it to her. Her resolve hardened into steel. She had to save him. Not just out of mercy anymore, but out of a desperate need for justice. His survival was now tied to her own fight for the truth. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the last of the water and cloth from her petticoat. Then, remembering the old folk remedies her grandmother had taught her, she searched the arroyo. She found what she was looking for: a creosote bush. She crushed the leaves, releasing their pungent medicinal smell, and packed the poultice into the wound to draw out the infection. The warrior watched her every move, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, she bandaged him with the last of her clean cloth. She offered him the last piece of her jerky, which he accepted and ate slowly. As a fragile truce settled over their small camp, a new sound reached them on the night wind. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The distant baying of hounds. The warrior's head snapped up, his body tensing. He looked at Abigail, and for the first time, she saw something other than hostility or pain in his eyes. She saw a shared, urgent fear. It was a posse. And out here, a posse could only be hunting one thing: him. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it wouldn't be the sheriff's posse. It would be Corbin's men. They weren't just hunting an Apache. They were hunting a witness, and now they would be hunting her, too. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice tight with dread. He pushed himself up, ignoring the searing pain, his eyes scanning the darkness. He was a warrior again, his instincts taking over. He looked at the fire, then at her. He made a swift, sharp gesture with his hand, slapping the ground. "Put it out." Abigail scrambled to smother the flames with sand. The darkness that enveloped them was sudden and absolute. The baying of the hounds was closer now. They were out of time. They had to run. The line shack was no longer a destination. It was a prayer. In the suffocating darkness, with the sound of Corbin's hounds echoing off the canyon walls, their journey transformed from a grim march into a desperate flight. The Apache warrior whom Abigail still thought of as Black Hawk was a different man. The lethargy of his fever was burned away by the fires of adrenaline. He was weak, but he was no longer passive. He pointed not toward the north where the shack lay, but toward a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the rock face of the arroyo. Abigail hesitated. It looked like a dead end. "The shack is this way," she whispered, pointing north. He shook his head vehemently, his eyes blazing with an intensity that demanded obedience. He pointed again to the fissure, then made a gesture mimicking the hounds, and then a slicing motion across his own throat. The message was clear. Corbin's men would expect them to take the most direct route, to follow the path of a white woman. This fissure was the path of an Apache. It was their only chance. Trusting his instinct over her own logic, she nodded. He squeezed through the narrow opening first, and she followed with Daisy, the horse's sides, scraping against the rock. The passage opened into a labyrinth of stone, a maze of winding gullies and shadowed crevasses that would be invisible to anyone not searching for it. He was in his element here. Despite his injury, he moved with a newfound purpose, his senses alive to the night. He showed her how to walk on the rock to leave no tracks, how to use the strange acoustics of the canyon to throw their scent. He was teaching her in his silent way the art of becoming a ghost. The baying of the hounds grew louder, then seemed to confusedly fade as the dogs lost their trail in the rocky maze. They had bought themselves time. For hours they moved through the darkness, the warrior navigating by the stars and the feel of the ground beneath his feet. Abigail was exhausted, her muscles screaming in protest, but she pushed on, driven by a new and powerful fuel vengeance. The piece of Corbin's branding iron was tucked safely in her saddlebag, a cold, hard promise of a reckoning to come. Just before dawn, he led them to a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of desert willow. It was barely large enough for the three of them. He collapsed inside, his strength finally deserting him. The front of his makeshift bandage was soaked with fresh blood. The flight had taken its toll. While he rested, Abigail ventured out to find water. He had led them to a place with a tinaja, a natural rock basin that collected rainwater. The water was lukewarm and green with algae, but it was life. She filled their canteens and brought one to him. As he drank, he looked at her, and his expression had changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. He pointed to himself. "Kohana," he said, his voice a dry, rough whisper. It was the first word he had spoken. "Kohana," she repeated. The name felt significant, solid. "I'm Abigail." He nodded, testing the name on his tongue, though he did not say it aloud. The barrier of silence had been broken. It was a fragile bridge, but it was a start. They spent the day hidden in the cave, the heat outside a physical presence. The hounds were gone for now. Kohana's fever returned with a vengeance. He shivered violently, despite the oppressive heat muttering in a language she didn't understand. Abigail did what she could, bathing his forehead with cool water and reapplying the creosote poultice which seemed to be helping. The angry red around the wound was beginning to fade. In his delirium, he spoke a single word. She recognized from the clumsy Spanish spoken by the ranchers. Agua. Water. But it wasn't a request. It was a memory. He said it with a tone of sorrow of loss. He thrashed his hands, reaching for something that wasn't there. Later that afternoon, as his fever broke and he slept a true healing sleep, Abigail inspected her saddlebags again, taking stock of her meager supplies. That's when she found it. Tucked into a side pocket, something she hadn't put there. It was a small, intricately beaded pouch, clearly of Apache make. It must have been in Kohana's possession, and it must have fallen out, and she'd picked it up without thinking. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a weapon or a talisman, but a small, smooth stone, a child's toy, and a lock of black hair tied with a piece of sinew. The hair of a woman. It was a memento, a keepsake of a family. This warrior, this savage, carried a reminder of his wife and child. A profound wave of shame washed over her. She had judged him, judged his entire people based on a lie fabricated by a greedy man. She had painted them all with the same brush of monstrous cruelty, never once considering that they too had families, loved ones, and sorrows. Kohana's grief, she suddenly realized, might be as deep and as raw as her own. When Kohana awoke, his eyes were clear. The fever was gone. He saw her holding the beaded pouch. A shadow passed over his face, a deep and painful sadness. He didn't try to take it from her. He simply looked at her, his guard completely down for the first time. Corbin, Abigail said, her voice low and intense. She pulled the piece of metal from her pocket and held it out for him to see. Corbin. Kohana's eyes widened. He stared at the piece of metal, then at her, and a torrent of understanding flowed between them. He reached out and took the metal shard, his fingers closing around it. He nodded slowly, his jaw tight with a cold fury that mirrored her own. Using a mixture of gestures and the few Spanish words they shared, he began to tell the story. He pointed to the south, then made a gesture of two men fighting. He pointed to his own chest, then held up one finger. One dead. Then he pointed to the ground, mimicking a man falling. Thomas. He then described other men holding up 5 fingers. He mimed them wearing feathers, mocking his people. He made the shape of a C with a bar under it in the dirt. Corbin's men. He pointed to himself, then to the south, indicating he had been coming from that direction. He had not been part of a raid. He had been alone, perhaps trading or hunting. He had stumbled upon the murder. He had been discovered. He mimicked them, chasing him, striking him from behind with the hot brand. He had run until he could run no more. The truth was laid bare between them in the silent, sweltering cave. Bartholomew Corbin hadn't just murdered her husband. He had tried to start a war. He had used the Apache as a scapegoat, counting on the ingrained hatred and fear of the settlers to cover his crime. A full-blown conflict would have driven everyone off the smaller ranches, leaving him to sweep in and claim all the land and water for himself. It was a plan of diabolical, breathtaking greed. And now, there were only 2 people in the entire territory who knew the truth, a disgraced widow and a hunted Apache warrior. They were no longer savior and victim. They were partners. Their individual quests for survival and justice had merged into one. "We need to get to the line shack," Abigail said, her voice filled with a new steely resolve. "You need to heal. Then we make Corbin pay." Kohana looked at her, and for the first time he smiled. It was a small, grim smile, but it was a bond forged in fire and truth. He nodded. "We make him pay." They traveled for another day, moving cautiously through the rugged terrain, until they finally saw it, the dilapidated roof of the old line shack, tucked away in its hidden canyon. It wasn't much, but it was sanctuary. It was a place to rest, to heal, and to plan their impossible fight against the most powerful man in the region. The line shack was a ruin, but to Abigail and Kohana, it was a fortress. The roof was partially caved in, and desert winds whispered through the gaps in the chinking, but it offered shade shelter and, most importantly, seclusion. A small, clear spring seeped from the rocks nearby, a trickle of life in the barren canyon. For the next 2 weeks, the shack became their world. A routine born of necessity fell into place. Abigail, using her knowledge of the land, hunted small game rabbits and quail with snares she fashioned from twine. Kohana, whose strength returned with each passing day, showed her which desert plants and schools where henselmoors were edible and which had medicinal properties beyond the creosote she had used. He taught her how to find the sweet fleshy pulp of the barrel cactus and how to prepare mesquite beans into a coarse, nutritious flour. The language barrier slowly eroded. They built a shared vocabulary of English, Spanish, and Apache words, supplemented by an expressive sign language of their own invention. In the quiet evenings, sitting by a carefully concealed fire, they shared their stories. Abigail spoke of Thomas, of their dream, to build a life in the vast open spaces of the West, a dream that had turned to dust. Kohana in turn spoke of his people, the Chiricahua. He spoke of his wife Ishton and his young son Taz, taken not by settlers, but by a fever that had swept through their camp the previous winter. He had been carrying the memento pouch on a journey to a sacred place to mourn them when he'd stumbled upon Corbin's men. Their shared grief was a powerful bond. They were two people from different worlds, united by loss and a thirst for justice. Abigail saw in Kohana not a savage warrior, but a proud, intelligent man mourning his family. He saw in her not a weak, helpless woman, but a person of immense courage and resilience. The prejudices they had both held were stripped away layer by layer until only the truth of their character remained. One afternoon, as he carved a new shaft for an arrow, Kohana paused. He looked at Abigail, his expression serious. He told her who he was. Not just a warrior, but the son of the great chief Taza. He was Nantan, a leader in training destined to guide his people. The journey he had been on was not just for mourning, but a rite of passage, a solitary quest to seek wisdom before he was ready to assume his father's mantle. The revelation landed with the weight of a stone. Abigail stared at him, comprehending the true magnitude of her actions. She had not just saved a random warrior. She had saved the future leader of the Chiricahua people. If Corbin's men had succeeded in killing him, it would have been an act of war with catastrophic consequences. Corbin, in his blind greed, had nearly ignited an inferno that would have consumed the entire region. "Your people, they will be looking for you," Abigail said. Kohana nodded. "They will search, but they will search the sacred lands to the east. They do not know I came this far west." He grew quiet, a thoughtful look on his face. My father. He is a man of peace. He has tried to keep the treaty with the White Eyes, even when they break it. But Corbin is not the only one. There are many who want war, who want our land. He looked at her directly. Your truth is our truth. Corbin must be exposed, not just for your Thomas, but for the hope of peace. If men like him succeed, there will never be peace. A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. They couldn't go to the law in Dusty Gulch. The sheriff, a man named Miller, was known to be a practical man, but he was also heavily influenced by Corbin, who was the town's primary employer and benefactor. Going to Miller with a fantastic story from a widow and the word of an Apache against the territory's most powerful rancher was suicide. They needed proof, hard, undeniable proof. The men who were with Corbin, Abigail said, thinking back to the day they brought Thomas's body to her. One of them, a man named Frank. He has a loud mouth and a weak chin. He drinks too much at the saloon. Kohana's eyes lit up with a hunter's gleam, a weak link in the chain. But they couldn't just ride into town. They were both wanted for different reasons. They needed help. Kohana knew where to find it. My people have a winter camp, he said, pointing toward a great flat-topped mountain that dominated the northern horizon. The Mescalero call it the Fortress of the Sky. It is a 2-day ride from here. They will be there now, preparing for the cold seasons. He paused, looking at her intently. Will you come, will you ride with me to my people? It was a question that hung in the air with immense weight. For a white woman to willingly go to an Apache camp was unheard of. It was stepping into the heart of what her world considered the enemy. It was an act of ultimate trust and of ultimate betrayal to her own people. But her people had already betrayed her. Her world was the lie that had been built by Bartholomew Corbin. Her truth was here in this canyon with this man. Yes, Abigail said, her voice clear and steady. I'll come. 2 days later, they set out at dawn. Kohana was now strong, moving with the lithe grace of a panther. He had fashioned a new bow and a quiver of arrows with lethal precision. Abigail rode Daisy her Winchester cleaned and loaded the shard of metal and the beaded pouch tucked safely in her saddlebag. The journey to the Chiricahua camp was a revelation. Kohana taught her to read the land in a way she never had before. He showed her hidden springs, pointed out the tracks of animals, and taught her the names of the mountains and the spirits that inhabited them. She was not a guest in his world. She was a student. As they approached the foothills of the great mountain, Kohana let out a sharp, piercing bird call. A few moments later, an identical call answered from the rocks above. 2 Apache riders appeared as if from thin air, materializing from the landscape. They were lean, hard men, with rifles across their laps and eyes that missed nothing. Their faces showed shock and suspicion as they saw Abigail. They spoke rapidly to Kohana in their own tongue, their gazes flicking towards her sharp and untrusting. Kohana spoke back, his voice calm and authoritative. He was no longer the wounded man she had found in the dust. He was Nantan, the son of their chief. He gestured to her, then spoke her name. Abigail. He then held up the shard of metal from Corbin's ranch. The warrior's expressions shifted from suspicion to a dark understanding. After a tense exchange, one of the riders dismounted and offered Abigail a water skin, a clear gesture of acceptance, if not welcome. They escorted them up a winding, cleverly hidden path into the mountain's heart. The camp was nestled in a wide, protected valley, invisible from the plains below. It was larger than Abigail had imagined, a bustling community of wick-ups and cook-fires. The scent of wood smoke and roasting meat filled the air. Women tended to children, men mended gear, and old ones sat in the sun, their faces maps of ancient wisdom. When they saw her, a white woman riding beside Kohana, a wave of silence fell over the camp. Every eye was on her. It was the most intimidating moment of her life. She felt 1,000 years of hatred and mistrust aimed directly at her. She kept her back straight, her gaze forward, just as Kohana had told her to. Show no fear. They were led to the largest wickiup in the center of the camp. An old, dignified man, with a face like carved granite and eyes that held the wisdom of ages, emerged. This was Chief Taza. Kohana embraced his father, a brief but powerful moment of reunion. Then he turned and began to speak, his voice ringing with passion and authority. He told the entire story, his journey, the murder of the white rancher, his wounding by Corbin's men, disguised as Apache, and how Abigail had saved him, tended his wounds, and uncovered the truth. He held up the metal shard for all to see. When he was finished, he looked at Abigail and gestured for her to come forward. Her heart hammered in her chest. She dismounted and walked to stand beside him, facing the chief. Chief Taza looked at her for a long, silent moment. His gaze was piercing, seeming to look straight into her soul. He was weighing her, judging her. Then he spoke in a low, resonant voice, and Kohana translated. He says, "The white eyes have brought us many sorrows. They speak with forked tongues, and their promises are dust on the wind." The chief's eyes were hard. He asks why he should believe the story of one of them. Abigail's throat was dry. She knew her life, and the hope of any justice hung on her next words. She looked not at Kohana, but directly at the old chief. "Because my husband is dead," she said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. Kohana translated. "Because the man who killed him now tries to light a fire between our peoples, a fire that will burn my home and yours. I do not ask you to trust my people. I ask you to trust our shared enemy." She then reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the small beaded pouch Kohana had carried. She held it out to the chief. "And because your son is a man of honor who loved his family, he would not lie about such a thing. I believe him, and he believes me." A murmur went through the crowd. Chief Taza looked at the pouch, then at his son, and then back at Abigail. A flicker of something surprise respect softened his hard features. He saw not a generic settler, but a specific woman who understood loss and who honored his son. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then he spoke a single word to Abigail, without need for translation, a word of peace and acceptance. "Welcome." In the shadow of the great mountain, a new, impossible alliance was forged. It was no longer just Abigail and Kohana against the world. It was the quiet determination of a widow and the strength of the Chiricahua nation united against a common foe. The stage was set for a reckoning. The plan they forged in the security of the mountain camp was one of bold deception, relying on nerve timing and an intimate knowledge of their enemy's character. They would not storm Corbin's fortress. They would dismantle it from within by targeting its weakest point, a greedy, cowardly ranch hand named Frank. Chief Taza dispatched 4 of his most adept warriors to act as unseen eyes in the hills surrounding Dusty Gulch, an invisible net of protection. Kohana. His noble features subtly altered with streaks of clay, and his hair, worn in the style of a northern tracker, would ride with Abigail. He was no longer just a witness. he was an instrument of justice. Their arrival in Dusty Gulch sent a ripple of shock through the town's stagnant air. The reclusive widow, Abigail Munro, had returned, and at her side rode a grim, imposing native who was clearly not from the local tribes. Ignoring the whispers and stares, Abigail strode with purpose directly into the dim, sour-smelling interior of the saloon. As they had hoped, Frank was in his usual spot, hunched over a glass of whiskey. He looked up as her shadow fell over him, his jaw dropping. "Mrs. Munro." He stammered, his eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and surprise. Abigail wasted no time on pleasantries. Her voice was low and cold for his ears only. "I've been away, Frank, thinking about the day my husband died at the South Pass." Frank's face, already flushed with whiskey, turned a pasty white. That was them Apaches, ma'am. A terrible business." "Was it?" Abigail held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. "I'm thinking of selling my land to Mr. Corbin, moving on. But a memory like that, it needs to be put to rest properly." She slid a heavy pouch of coins onto the sticky table, the metal clinking with a sound of finality. "This is for your trouble. A bonus from Mr. Corbin, let's say, for your continued discretion." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned and walked out, leaving Frank staring at the pouch as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. The trap was set. Frank, terrified she knew the truth, and tempted by the money, would run straight to his master. Corbin, hearing that Abigail was back and asking questions, would have no choice but to silence his loose-lipped accomplice for good. That evening, just as planned, one of Taza's warriors slipped into their camp on the edge of town. His report was brief and clear. Frank had met with two of Corbin's most trusted men. A meeting was set for midnight. The location, the old, abandoned smithy. Leaving Kohana as a silent sentinel in the shadows across the street, Abigail walked directly into Sheriff Miller's office. The lawman looked up, his weary face showing his surprise. "Mrs. Munro, I heard you were back." "I am," she said, closing the door firmly behind her. "And I'm here to stop a murder." She dropped the twisted shard of the C-bar branding iron on his desk. It skittered across the wood, coming to rest beside his inkwell. "This was pulled from the back of the man waiting outside my husband's witness. Your boss, Bartholomew Corbin, didn't just kill my husband. He's about to kill one of his own men to cover it up." Miller stared at the piece of metal, his expression a mask of conflict. "Those are dangerous words. You have no proof, only the word of an Apache." "I have the truth." Abigail's voice was sharp, cutting through his excuses. "In less than an hour, two of Corbin's men are meeting Frank at the old smithy to permanently buy his silence. You can sit here and polish your badge while another man dies. Or you can pick up your gun and see for yourself what kind of law Bartholomew Corbin practices." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "The question, Sheriff, is what kind of law you serve." The challenge struck home. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of compromise, Miller stood up and strapped on his gun belt. "If you're wrong, you'll be run out of this territory on a rail." "If I'm right," Abigail countered, "you'll be the first honest lawman this town has seen in a decade." The three of them, the widow, the sheriff, and the warrior, melted into the darkness surrounding the derelict smithy. They watched as a nervous Frank slipped inside, followed moments later by two hulking figures. Muffled voices gave way to a cry of panic, then the sickening, meaty thud of a pistol whip and a choked groan. "That's enough for me," Miller gritted out, drawing his revolver. "This is the sheriff. "Come out with your hands where I can see them." His answer was a muzzle flash from the doorway, a bullet splintering the post inches from his head. The night exploded into chaos. Miller returned fire, pinning the men inside. But it was Kohana who ended it. Moving with fluid silence, he flanked the building. As one of the thugs appeared in a side window to get a better angle, an arrow hissed through the darkness, burying itself in the man's shoulder. He screamed and fell back. His partner, seeing he was caught between the sheriff's pistol and a ghost in the night, threw his gun down in surrender. Inside, Frank was bleeding and terrified, but alive. With his life on the line and his loyalty to Corbin shattered, the whole sordid story came pouring out: the staged raid, Thomas's murder, and Corbin's grand plan. There was no hesitation in Sheriff Miller now. At dawn, he rode at the head of a posse with a determined Abigail and a stoic Kohana at his side. They found Bartholomew Corbin on his porch, a supremely confident smile on his face. "Sheriff," Corbin called out jovially, "don't tell me you're finally doing something about the squatters on my north range." Miller dismounted his shotgun, held loosely in his hand. "I'm not here about squatters, Bart," he said, his voice as cold and hard as iron. "I'm here to arrest you for the murder of Thomas Monroe and for conspiracy against the peace of this territory." Corbin's smile evaporated. He stared past Miller, his gaze falling on Abigail's triumphant, furious face and the imposing figure of Kohana beside her. The master of the territory saw his world so carefully built on fear and blood, utterly undone by the two people he had wronged the most. For a heartbeat, his hand drifted toward his pistol, but the cold resolve in Miller's eyes and the deadly stillness of the Apache warrior told him it was over. The reckoning had come to Dusty Gulch. The trial of Bartholomew Corbin was a landmark event. Abigail's calm, resolute testimony, combined with Frank's terrified confession, laid the conspiracy bare. But it was Kohana who turned the tide. Standing before the court, not as a savage, but as the son of a chief, he spoke with a quiet dignity that commanded respect and dismantled a generation of prejudice. Found guilty, Corbin's empire of greed crumbled into dust, his name becoming a curse in the territory he once ruled. The verdict sent a shockwave through the region, not erasing decades of mistrust overnight, but cracking the foundation of hatred. A fragile bridge had been built between two peoples, and Abigail Monroe was its architect. She remained at the ranch on Bitter Creek, which transformed from a place of sorrow into a symbol of peace. Her home became neutral ground, a sanctuary where disputes were settled with words instead of weapons. The settlers called her the Woman of Bitter Creek, but the Apache gave her a name of higher honor, she who walks between two skies. Kohana returned to his people, eventually succeeding his father as the great chief of the Chiricahua. He led with strength, but his rule was always tempered by the memory of the woman who offered him water in the desert. Their unlikely friendship endured for the rest of their lives, a quiet testament to the bond they had forged. And so the story became a legend told around settler campfires and Chiricahua lodges alike, a tale of a lone widow and a future chief who through a single act of mercy rewrote the fate of a land and proved that courage and honor belong to no single race. The story of Abigail Monroe and Kohana is more than just a tale from the Old West. It's a powerful reminder that our assumptions about others are often the most dangerous fictions of all. In a world defined by conflict and prejudice, they chose a different path. Abigail's choice to show mercy to a man she was supposed to hate, and Kohana's willingness to trust a woman he had every reason to fear, literally changed the course of history for their people. Their story proves that true strength isn't found in vengeance, but in understanding, and that the bravest acts are often quiet personal decisions that ripple outward to touch countless lives. If their incredible journey of courage and unlikely friendship moved you, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of hidden history and unsung heroes. Thank you for listening.